And what tends to happen is that the banks overexpand. They play too many of those cards, and at a certain stage the market says, no, there's too much money out here in terms of real resources, and you get what's called the bank run. People come back to the banks and will make good on these promises. The banks can't do it. You have recession, depression, what have you, the whole credit structure drops. Now, if that kind of a system were fully disclosed and everyone knew how it was working, my anticipation is that there would be very few fractional reserve banks.
The framers of the Constitution were quite aware of the liabilities of bills of credit and fractional reserve banking. And this is why Article 1 states no state shall make anything but gold and silver a tender in the payment of debts. And, quote, no state shall emit bills of credit.
The Federal Reserve System should be abolished. It was not authorized in the Constitution, therefore we shouldn't have it. But I take a sort of a moderate approach to doing it because there's a lot of people who depend on the system today, and I wouldn't close it down in one day, but I would legalize competition, allow gold and silver to circulate as money, take taxes off gold and silver so you didn't have to pay sales taxes or capital gains taxes, and let the people transition over to gold and silver. Since 1976 we weren't even allowed to own gold. And then later on we got the American Gold Eagle. So we're moving in that direction, but we need to go a little bit further to legalize contracts in gold. The real culprit is the ability of the Fed to monetize debt. Members of Congress spend money for war and welfare. They can't borrow enough and they can't tax enough, so they literally create treasury bills out of thin air, and then the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and buys the treasury bills, and that has to eventually destroy the value of the dollar.
If we were to abolish the Federal Reserve System tomorrow and get the banks out of it completely, turn the entire function as it now operates over to the Treasury, nothing would change. The same people would still dominate the system from behind the scenes. So this question of ownership receives too much attention, because where that idea goes is that, well, if we can just find out who owns these banks, and if we don't like who they are, then we can support a move to abolish the Federal Reserve and turn that system over to the Treasury, exactly as it's now operating. So the focus should not be on who owns the banks, but on what the banks are doing.
If the public better understood how fiat money can be abused by Congress, it would impeach almost every member and abolish the Federal Reserve Central Bank, as it has done twice in the nation's history. Like the Federal Reserve System, the Congress has been further distorting the letter of its constitutional responsibilities by delegating its power to declare war to another entity, in this case, the President.
One of the great problems the country faces is the cowardice of the Congress of the United States as an institution. It has allowed the President to usurp the war-making power.
Where does Congress get authority to delegate the responsibility to declare war to the President? It's not in the Constitution. This delegation sounds more like an evasion of responsibility for political expediency than the original intent of the founders.
It has resigned its authority. It is frightened of exercising its authority. It does not want responsibility. It does not want accountability.
Article 1, Section 8 clearly states, Congress shall have power to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to provide for calling forth the militia.
People such as George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, the leaders of the Army, didn't think much of the militia. The militia came for 30, 60, 90, 180 days, and then when their enlistment time ran out, they went home. They didn't have to stay. They came with sort of an oddment of firearms, Typically, they were firearms that didn't entirely fit the Army pattern. They had different calibers, logistics problems arose. The men weren't clearly not as well trained as the regular soldiers. They had a tendency to break when the British charged them with bayonets, for instance. So people like Washington, who was obviously very influential at the time, didn't have a particularly good word to say about the militia. So one would have thought when the Constitution was drafted, the Founding Fathers would have left the militia out. We don't need this. Hadn't proven to be that effective. Or they might have said, well, Congress or the states can set up a militia if they want to, but it's discretionary. Depends on circumstances. They did the exact opposite. They recognized the existence of what they called the militia of the several states at the time. It's constitutionally recognized. And then the Second Amendment comes along and says it's necessary to the security of a free state. So I would say the Constitution makes it absolutely clear that those entities, because it's not one entity, that should be one in every one of the states, is a key structural element of the Constitution. And why? Well, it's because ultimately, who's the militia? It's the people.
With every shooting on a college campus, the cultural Marxist indoctrinating mainstream media never mentions the true source of the problem, the disintegration of the family unit. Instead, the media pushes the socialist agenda of removing citizens' Second Amendment rights.
Let's go to the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Just take the first clause. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Stop right there. That's the only place in the Constitution where the Constitution says that anything is necessary for any reason. The Constitution doesn't say Congress is necessary, the President's necessary, the Supreme Court is necessary. It doesn't even say the states are necessary. It says a well-regulated militia is necessary to what? To the security. Well, not just any kind of security, but the security of a free state. And that's the sole purpose of the Constitution in toto.
The way that the United States was set up originally was that the defense of the nation was to be primarily the responsibility of the states. They were to create militia drawn upon able-bodied American citizens within the state. They were to provide their weapons and their training and their leaders. They were to form into a national fighting force, and they would defend the borders of the United States against foreign enemies. But the primary foundation, the element of that, was the militia.
Never stated in movies like Bowling for Columbine, movies funded by cultural Marxist-infiltrated Hollywood studios, is the original intent of the founders that all citizens retain the right to keep and bear arms. More accurately, the obligation to keep and bear arms as part of the militia.
The Michigan militia wanted everyone to know that they were nothing like McVeigh and Nichols.
This is an American tradition. It's an American responsibility to be armed.
I'm sure you guys are the kind of people that people would like to have as their neighbor.
As the Constitution tells us, a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. Now, some people may disagree with that, and my response is, well, that's a personal opinion. The law is otherwise. Right? The law tells us that this is the principle on which we're supposed to be operating. You don't like that, amend it. If it's there, enforce it. If you don't enforce it, there will be some consequence, because the Constitution is, how should I put this? It's an integrated document in the sense that all of the parts were designed to function with all of the others simultaneously. And if you look at it, there are several pillars to it. There's, of course, the federal government, the Congress, President, and the Supreme Court. There are the states. There are the people as electors. And then there's this group of entities called the militia. And read the Constitution through and you'll see they're essentially all on an equal plane. They all fit into this structure. Well, if an architect designs a building with 5 support columns, it's probably because he believes every one of those is necessary. You knock one of those out or you allow it to decay, and you can pretty much expect that that building is not going to be stable over the long term. Certain kinds of shocks affect it, it's going to come down. Same thing with a governmental structure. Governmental structure was designed in such a way that the people were supposed to play an important role in maintaining political power of military force.
Instead, the Frankfurt School's agenda of